When it comes to the cultural warfare that I've been discussing in many of my videos, Edgar Allan Poe was indeed a very important figure. I even read an article recently which proved that Edgar Allan Poe was not, or did not die of alcoholism and opium addiction, as many of us believe, that he was poisoned, because during his lifetime he participated in a counterintelligence program in the United States that was working against the Confederacy, which was actually run by the British. The British have had a huge influence in many of these different things historically in the United States. And because of that, much later on, Edgar Allan Poe, during his travels when he was in Baltimore, died mysteriously. Well, no, he didn't die at that stage, but he was poisoned at that stage. They saw him lying there in this sort of delirium. You know, he was unconscious. They didn't know what had happened. They took him to the hospital. And during the 4 days that he was there before he died in the hospital, it was even proven that he refused alcohol as a form of treatment. So he didn't never engage in alcohol during his lifetime. He even refused it as a form of treatment. And after he died, the medical practitioner and the medical records had proven that he had never consumed opium, that he had never consumed alcohol during his life. And he had actually been poisoned twice. The first time it obviously not worked, the second time did. So this completely destroys. But actually, another thing I was going to mention about a very important thing about is these really, actually very heroic, not these sort of melancholic kind of, feats that he had during his lifetime, which were that he had collaborated with James Fenimore Cooper in helping the Marquis de Lafayette establish a French Republic. And Marquis de Lafayette was also working against this sort of anti-American kind of propaganda that was being spread by the British. So there's a few very important things that are going on in this story that relate to, well, number one, I believe I have mentioned that in my own book series, which is called The Fall of John Roe, there's this sort of imaginary, not a real historical thing in Iceland, it's just something I fabricated, this sort of imaginary monarchic republic, sort of utopia, that happens, that forms in Iceland, which these traitors are trying to destroy, and the traitors are indeed these sort of hedonistic and lecherous and amoral people, and they're trying to destroy it. So you see a very similar cultural warfare there, and John Roe is indeed the villain, one of the major culprits. He's one of the traitors who are fighting against an artist named Edmund, who, like Edgar Allan Poe, uses his own artistic ingenuity in this battle. And Edmund was actually a child prodigy. He's a famous composer, brilliant composer, who fights this battle his whole life. And so this sort of monarchic republic, this sort of utopian sort of equilibrium, allows a free society without sort of the majority overrunning the minority, where indeed everyone has a voice, but things are also approached in a systematic, disciplined manner. And that's where the monarchic aspect comes into play. And so there is another very interesting parallel. But I think even more importantly, though, this image that we have in our heads of Edgar Allan Poe being this sort of, I don't know how to describe it, this sort of manic and perverse, or the brooding dark figure with all these sorts of addictions, has been planted into American culture, and there have been actual real examples of this that have been created. But I'll back up a little bit first. I think just to explain Griswold, who was a shady figure in Edgar Allan Poe's life, and Griswold was indeed on the side of this sort of British oligarchy that I was discussing a few minutes ago, was writing letters about Edgar Allan Poe, describing him as this manic sort of dark character, someone who was irresponsible, didn't do well in school. They're actually trivializing the whole purpose of his work by making his work into this kind of romanticized darkness. Basically, it defeats the whole purpose of what he was actually doing, which is actually not very different from what Beethoven was doing. There's actually a direct quote from Beethoven where he's like trying to sort of create a higher sense of the sublime in his music. He believed in God. There was a higher purpose, and so in Edgar Allan Poe's work, there was even indeed you could say a humanist kind of perspective that was fighting in this sort of cultural battle. And there's even references in his work, as much there are references to ghouls and ghosts. There's references to heaven, angels. I mean, and that is a sort of you could argue a mythologized projection or a mythologized sort of representation of actual humanistic values. Like as I discussed in a couple of videos ago, it's heaven looked at from a humanistic perspective, and not necessarily from the sort of scary, patriarchal kind of, perspective that we in America and the West we tend to fear. And that, as an example, as I said, there's in the poem The Raven, Lenore and her sort of her existence in heaven, her residence in heaven, and Edgar Allan Poe imploring and asking the Raven, well, is she there? Like, he's not even sure, but he asks, well, is Lenore there? Or no, the Raven will not answer him. So that is indeed one example, I think. But I think the ways that this whole cultural stereotype has leaked into American culture, you can even see in Sylvia Plath. Like, she's an actual example of what they were trying to misrepresent Poe as. Like, she's like the living flesh and blood thing. Like, because she romanticized her own suicide attempts, and she wrote this really bizarre poetry that was not even terribly well written, but this beautification of self-destruction and alienation, you also see in as I discussed in Catcher in the Rye, the sort of slow denigration of Holden Caulfield. But one thing I did notice that was interesting to me recently was that when I looked up J.D. Salinger on Google, below that, as I was searching below all of the articles and everything, there was this little tidbit it left that said that schools are banning The Catcher in the Rye because of its supposedly anti-God or anti-white sentiment. And that narrative, I mean, I'm sorry to say, does seem a little bit suspicious to me, because it makes it sound as if people, and I'm not sure, I don't want to leap to any judgments immediately, but it does seem like people who might have had legitimate concerns, like actual real concerns about the book, and noticed things that were actually problematic or ideologically very dangerous, were being framed or made to look as if they were just religious zealots, if they had any reservations, if they had any problems with it. And like I said, this is just an impression, a feeling I have. I don't know. I'm also, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a proponent of banning books. I don't think anything should be banned, even if ideologically it's completely wrong and I don't agree with it. That's not the point. My point is that the whole narrative seems like it could be false. It could have been people with legitimate concerns that were made to look crazy. And this is a pattern that you see throughout history, and it seems to continue.